The day the invasion began, April 1st, 1945, was Easter Sunday. Across the Western world, bells were ringing in celebration of resurrection and renewal. But off the shores of a relatively obscure island named Okinawa, a different kind of ritual was commencing, the largest, most deadly sacrificial offering of the Pacific War. This was Operation Iceberg, and its target was the Ryukyu archipelago's largest landmass, barely 3 or 40 nautical miles from Kyushu, the soft, unsuspecting underbelly of the Japanese home islands, for the hundreds of thousands of men of the U.S. 10th Army and the 5th Fleet, sailing under a sky of unsettling calm. This was not just another island to be conquered, it was the final, inevitable gate to the Imperial heartland. There was no sense of April Fool's humor aboard the landing craft. There was only the cold, metallic dread that had become endemic to this theater of war. They knew the cost. They had read the reports from Iwo Jima, where the enemy, fighting from deep subterranean defenses, had achieved a casualty rate for the invaders that shattered all previous expectations. The veterans knew that, as the war drew closer to Tokyo, the willingness of the Japanese to die was no longer a matter of policy, but a matter of national fervor, consecrated by the emperor himself. The mission for the defenders of Okinawa was brutally simple: exact such a horrific, unsustainable price in American blood that the politicians in Washington, D.C. would recoil from the planned invasion of Japan, forcing a compromised peace. Okinawa was the final lesson, the bloody prologue to the atomic age. The invasion force was immense, a floating city of steel and firepower unparalleled in the war's history. 2 Marine divisions, 1st and 6th, and 2 Army Infantry divisions, 7th and 96th, stormed ashore at the Hagushi beaches on the island's western side. The accompanying bombardment was designed to annihilate, transforming the coastline into a pulverized, unrecognizable landscape. Yet, when the landing craft finally scraped sand at 8:30 a.m., there was an eerie, profound silence. The expected curtain of fire, the desperate, costly beach defense that had characterized Tarawa and Prelude, simply did not materialize. The shock was palpable. The men ran across the beaches and pushed inland, seizing key airfields with unnerving ease. By midday, they had pushed several miles inland, encountering only scattered small arms fire. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the imposing commander of the 10th Army, must have felt a flicker of bewildered relief. Was it possible had the enemy finally broken their doctrine of suicidal defense? The veterans, the ones whose eyes held the vacant, 1,000-yard stare of combat, felt a deeper, visceral unease. This was not a retreat, it was an invitation. The deceptive calm was the opening move of a master strategist, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army. Ushijima was not an architect of glorious feudal banzai charges. He was a practitioner of cold, calculating attrition. He had learned from the defeats defending the vulnerable beaches was pointless. Better to surrender the coastline and draw the American forces inland, where the rugged terrain of the island's southern spine offered natural defenses that could be transformed into an impenetrable fortress. Ushijima had spent months overseeing the construction of the Shuri Line, a defense-in-depth system that ran across the southern ridges of Okinawa. The line, anchored by the ancient, iconic Shuri Castle, was a labyrinth of interconnected caves, reinforced concrete pillboxes, hidden machine gun nests, and artillery positions so thoroughly tunneled and mutually supporting that they were virtually immune to the American naval bombardments. The defenders were not just in holes, they were in an entire underground city, and they were waiting. The Americans, having achieved an easy, unopposed landing, walked directly into Ushijima's grand trap. Their swift push quickly ground to an agonizing halt as they hit the first line of the Japanese defenses in the south. The battle immediately shifted from amphibious assault to systematic, excruciating siege warfare. simultaneously. The second dimension of Ushijima's attritional strategy unfolded in the sky, and on the waves, the Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum operations. While the infantrymen fought the invisible enemy on the land, the American fleet surrounding the island was subjected to a coordinated, unrelenting series of mass suicide attacks by Japanese pilots, the Kamikaze. These attacks were a direct response to the massive firepower disparity. With no hope of conventional victory, the Japanese military high command resorted to the only asset they had left: the absolute willingness of their young men to die for the emperor, weaponizing the pilot and his plane into a guided missile. The sheer scale was terrifying. Over the next 3 months, 10 massive Kikusui waves would strike the fleet, involving nearly 1,500 planes. The American sailors, accustomed to the precision and technology of modern naval warfare, were paralyzed by the psychological terror of an enemy who could not be deterred by firepower or logic. A destroyer could use every gun, every anti-aircraft round it possessed, but the pilot's trajectory, once set, was immutable. The sound of the aircraft engine screaming its final frantic descent toward the deck became the soundtrack to the battle. The waters surrounding Okinawa, known to the sailors as Kamikaze Alley, were constantly alight with burning ships and crisscrossed by the wakes of destroyers rushing to pick up survivors or assist stricken vessels, carriers, battleships, and particularly the vulnerable radar picket destroyers stationed far out to warn the main fleet, were all targets. The destroyer USS Laffey, for example, would endure a barrage of 22 kamikaze hits and near misses on April 16th, earning the chilling deserved nickname, the ship that would not die. The naval losses were staggering, surpassing the total casualties incurred by the Navy and Coast Guard combined in every other battle of the Pacific War. This hellish combination, the invisible, entrenched enemy on land, and the relentless suicidal storm from the sky defined Okinawa. It was war stripped of maneuver, reduced to a brutal, raw contest of endurance, flesh against concrete, and psychology against fanatical devotion. The easy landing of Easter Sunday was forgotten. Now, every inch of ground was bought at the highest price. The psychological torment inflicted by Ushijima's attritional strategy was immediate and multi-layered. On land, the Americans found themselves fighting an enemy they could rarely see, a ghost army entrenched in the Ugofu, the vast cave networks and interlocking pillboxes that formed the Shuri line. This was not the rapid maneuvering or open combat celebrated by military textbooks. This was a slow, agonizing grind against concrete, limestone, and flesh rendered fanatical by doctrine. Every ridge was a furnace, every ravine a deadly ambush site. The two main army divisions, the 7th and 96th, pushing toward the high ground in the south, encountered the first deliberate, complex defensive belts in mid-April. They soon ran into the notorious Kakazu Ridge, which was not a single geographic feature, but a complex system of defensive positions integrated into the landscape itself. The Japanese commanders, using their deep tunneling to shelter from the relentless pre-bombardment, would wait until the Americans advanced, then pour out a massive, concerted fire. When the U.S. troops finally took one position, the hidden defenders would simply retreat through the subterranean tunnels, emerge at an unexpected location, and launch a furious counterattack, often behind the advancing American lines. This tactical ghosting drove the soldiers to the brink of psychological collapse. Historians would later note that the battle for Okinawa was defined by the unique challenge of having to kill the enemy several times over. Given the depth and resilience of the Shuri fortifications, the standard procedure evolved into a brutal, specialized dance infantry would use flamethrowers to clear the entrances, followed by demolitions teams, often marine engineers crawling forward under heavy fire to place massive charges, satchel charges, or shaped explosives to seal the caves and bunkers permanently. The men doing this grisly work rarely knew if they were sealing a handful of snipers or hundreds of combatants. Sometimes, the muffled screams from within the sealed positions offered a grim, unambiguous answer. The rain soon arrived, transforming the battlefield into an even more nightmarish tableau. Okinawa's soil, rich in volcanic clay, quickly turned into a thick, clinging morass. Tanks, essential for blasting the concrete emplacements, became bogged down and vulnerable to concentrated Japanese fire. The infantrymen, weighed down by gear, slipped constantly, navigating trenches filled not just with mud, but with the bodies of the fallen, turning the entire theater of operations into a colossal, stinking quagmire. Compounding this misery on land was the escalating terror at sea. The Kikusui attacks were now arriving in unprecedented numbers. By mid-April, the American fleet was suffering casualties at a staggering, historically unmatched rate. The Japanese operational strategy recognized that they could not win a conventional engagement, but they understood the psychological and material impact of sinking large capital ships. The goal was twofold: to break the naval supply lines and, more critically, to break the fighting spirit of the USA Navy. The climax of the naval struggle occurred on April 7th, with the deployment of the ultimate Japanese suicide mission, Operation Tengo. This was the final, desperate sortie of the mighty Japanese battleship, Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, along with its escort screen. The Yamato was sent on a one-way trip, carrying barely enough fuel to reach Okinawa, where it was intended to beach itself and serve as an unmovable artillery battery to defend the island. The Americans viewed this as a gift from their intelligence services. A combined force of over 300 carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 intercepted the Yamato before it could even get within sight of Okinawa. What followed was a spectacle of overwhelming air power and catastrophic naval destruction. Dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked in wave after wave, hammering the Leviathan with torpedoes and bombs. The sight of the 70,000-ton behemoth, battered and burning, eventually rolling over and exploding in a colossal mushroom cloud, a cloud so enormous it was visible 100 miles away, signaled the definitive end of the battleship era and the absolute supremacy of the aircraft carrier in naval warfare. However, the sinking of the Yamato, while a victory of spectacular proportions, did little to abate the Kamikaze terror. The pilots continued to plunge from the sky, a daily, nerve-shattering lottery for the sailors below. The radar picket ships, stationed 50 to 70 miles from the main fleet to provide early warning, were virtual bullseyes. In a single month, more than 20 of these destroyers and smaller vessels were either sunk or crippled by suicide attacks. The combination of the unseen enemy on land and the inescapable terror from the sky meant that no one, from the infantryman slogging through the mud of Kakazu Ridge to the sailor standing watch aboard a destroyer, felt safe. Okinawa was a battle fought not just against a conventional army, but against a collective will to self-destruction. And the American forces were paying the highest price they had yet incurred in the Pacific War. This extreme level of sacrifice was beginning to ripple back to Washington, casting a dark shadow over the strategies being finalized for the home islands of Japan. The prolonged agony of the fighting on Okinawa soon settled into a pattern of psychological and physical exhaustion for the American ground troops, a grinding battle of concrete and claustrophobia. The main thrust into the southern fortified sector began with a sustained, head-on attack against the Shuri line, but General Ushijima's design proved horrifically effective. The key wasn't the strength of the positions themselves, but their integration. They were mutually supporting, meaning that the moment a GI unit gained one ridge, they were instantly exposed to punishing enfilade fire from positions previously thought to be neutralized, or from the mouth of a cave suddenly spitting fire 50 yards away. The U.S. Army, specifically the 7th and 96th Divisions, bore the brunt of this initial, brutal confrontation, fighting over named features that instantly entered the dark lexicon of the War Horseshoe Ridge, Tombstone Ridge, and the chillingly named Hacksaw Ridge, or the Maida Escarpment. This latter position epitomized the cruelty of the defense. It was a nearly vertical cliff face, riddled with caves, tunnels, and machine gun bunkers, presenting an almost insurmountable natural barrier that the Japanese had meticulously enhanced. Taking it required scaling the cliff under a constant barrage of fire and grenades, a desperate hand-over-hand climb that transformed men into targets. The nature of the fight devolved into a grim, close-quarters slugging match, demanding specialized, suicidal bravery. The term mopping up became a bloody joke. Every hole had to be cleared, every cave flushed out. It wasn't enough to secure the outside. The fighting continued deep underground, sometimes for days, where the air was suffocating and men fought in pitch darkness, using flashlights and bayonets. The Japanese defenders, often fighting until the last man, employed white phosphorus grenades, snipers, and deadly feints, transforming the interior of the island into an industrial-scale meat grinder. The relentless nature of the defense forced the Americans to develop new, equally brutal tactics. The blowtorch and corkscrew became the grim standard. One team would suppress the enemy with flamethrowers, burning out the entrance and denying air. Then, engineers would sprint forward to place massive amounts of explosive, the corkscrew, to seal the cave or bunker forever. This was the only certain way to neutralize the determined, invisible enemy. The cost of these frontal assaults was devastating. Unit cohesion frayed under the constant stress, and casualty rates soared higher than any previous Pacific engagement. The men endured relentless shelling, constant exposure to rain that turned their foxholes into muddy tombs, and the perpetual knowledge that the enemy was literally beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the naval campaign continued its catastrophic tempo. The sinking of the Yamato in early April, while a tactical triumph, had only emboldened the Japanese to launch more kamikaze attacks, recognizing the success of the psychological terror and material damage they inflicted. The entire Fifth Fleet was now fighting a perpetual battle of vigilance, with sailors forced to watch the skies for the inevitable, screaming descent of the suicide planes. The greatest threat remained the radar picket destroyers, cruising miles away from the main task force to provide crucial minutes of early warning. These ships were sacrifices, magnets for the kamikaze pilots, and the toll was horrifying. The USS Laffey, which survived 22 direct hits and near misses, became a legend, but many others were simply annihilated, vaporized in colossal explosions, as the plane, often carrying bombs, struck the hull or superstructure. Over the course of the battle, the U.S. Navy would suffer nearly 5,000 casualties and see 36 ships sunk, more than any other naval engagement in the war. This twin terror, the invisible, entrenched foe on land, and the suicidal, inescapable foe in the sky, created a level of systemic strain never before seen. The sheer human cost and the uncompromising brutality of the Japanese defense were the factors General Ushijima had banked on. He was not trying to save Okinawa, he was trying to shatter the American resolve by demonstrating, in blood, the price of invading the home islands. Every single American casualty on Okinawa was intended as a political argument back in Washington, D.C., against the final, decisive invasion. By the end of April, the American forces were stalled, facing an impregnable, heavily manned line that stretched across the narrow waist of the island. General Buckner, under immense pressure, decided to change tack. Instead of relying solely on frontal infantry assaults, he ordered a massive, coordinated effort involving armor, air support, and specialized flame-throwing tanks. He was forced to fight Ushijima's war of attrition, but he intended to use America's overwhelming material superiority to win it. The stage was set for the pivotal, destructive final push to Shuri Castle, a confrontation that would define the entire course of the battle and, ultimately, the final end of the war itself. The shift in tactics was mandated by the casualty lists. By the middle of May, the U.S. 10th Army had suffered thousands of casualties, an unbearable human toll for the amount of ground gained. General Buckner recognized that his troops were fighting a war of exhaustion against an enemy whose doctrine was exhaustion. He could not afford to sustain the slow, inch by inch, bunker by bunker struggle across the southern ridges indefinitely. The final objective, Shuri Castle, was the symbolic and military anchor of Ushijima's entire defensive system. Its capture was not just tactical, it was essential to breaking the psychological resistance of the entire Japanese 32nd Army. Buckner launched his decisive offensive in mid-May, utilizing the massive material superiority that only the United States could bring to bear. The push was a systematic exercise in brute force engineering, naval bombardment, relentless artillery barrages, and the innovative deployment of armored flame-throwing tanks. Most famously, the M4 Sherman with the Zippo flame turret. These tanks were the answer to the cave problem. While infantry fought the enemy on the ridges, the Zippos drove right up to the cave entrances, saturating them with burning napalm, denying the Japanese the ability to pop up behind American lines or to survive their subterranean bunkers. The Americans faced not only machine guns and mortars, but the weather itself. The seasonal rains turned the battlefield into a horror show of mud and blood. The roads, pulverized by artillery, dissolved into impassable bogs, choking the essential supply lines. Ambulances could not reach the front. Tanks were mired in the quagmire. Soldiers lived, fought, and slept in waterlogged foxholes alongside the dead. The psychological effect was profound. The men were fighting in conditions that physically resembled the Western Front of the First World War, a nightmarish regression into trench warfare, only now augmented by the tropical heat and the threat of airborne suicide bombers. The climax of this grinding assault came at Shuri Castle. This castle, an ancient seat of the Ryukyu Kingdom, sat atop the highest ground, offering a perfect observation point and serving as General Ushijima's headquarters, though the main command post was buried deep beneath it. The Marine and Army divisions converged on the complex from different directions, fighting what felt like a feudal siege using modern weapons. The final push was led by the 1st Marine Division, who, after weeks of brutal combat, finally breached the outer defenses. The decision to destroy the castle became one of the battle's greatest historical controversies. The Americans knew the Japanese headquarters was deep underground, impervious to air attack. On May 29th, recognizing the tactical necessity of eliminating the observation post and demoralizing the remaining defenders, the U.S. Navy cruiser USS Mississippi fired several colossal 16-inch shells directly into the castle complex. The ancient structure, a symbol of Okinawan culture and heritage, was obliterated in a spectacular explosion. The destruction of the castle proved tactically effective. It broke the structural integrity of the main defense line and, more importantly, concealed the withdrawal of the Japanese command. General Ushijima, recognizing the line was broken and unable to sustain the defense, ordered his forces to pull back to the extreme south of the island. This was not a surrender, it was a move to extend the blood price. Ushijima intended to draw the Americans onto the Kaiyan Peninsula, a bottleneck of land where he could inflict even greater casualties from his final, pre-prepared defensive nests. The subsequent chase across the southern tip of the island was brutal, characterized by disorganized, desperate fighting from retreating Japanese forces mingled with terrified Okinawan civilians. It was in this final phase that the battle's true, horrific human cost became fully realized. The fighting had always involved the native Okinawans, many of whom were pressed into service as forced laborers or, tragically, manipulated by Japanese propaganda into believing that capture by the Americans meant torture and rape. Historical records, including American intelligence reports, confirm the systematic effort by Japanese officers to encourage civilians to commit suicide rather than surrender. Terrified Okinawans, trapped between the ferocious American advance and the fanatical Japanese rearguard, leaped from cliffs, used grenades on their families, or retreated into caves only to be caught in the ceiling blasts of American engineers. The casualty rate among the civilian population was staggering, estimated at well over 100,000, representing nearly one-third of the island's population, a tragedy that underscored the barbaric, uncompromising nature of the fighting. Okinawa was not just a military operation, it was a societal catastrophe, turning the island into a literal charnel house. The retreat of the Japanese forces from the Shuri Line was not a rout, but a meticulously planned tactical withdrawal, intended only to reposition the remaining strength into the final, unyielding defensive pocket on the Cayenne Peninsula. General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, made their last stand in the rugged coral highlands near the town of Mabuni. They understood that the war on Okinawa was now a pure sacrifice, a test of will meant to influence American war planning thousands of miles away. Every American man killed was, in their final calculation, one less man available for the inevitable invasion of the Japanese homeland. The closing weeks of June 1945 turned the southern tip of Okinawa into a confined space of absolute terror. The terrain here was even more challenging than the Shuri Hills, dominated by high, jagged cliffs that dropped sharply to the sea. The Japanese soldiers, fighting from isolated cave systems and pillboxes carved into the cliff faces, had nowhere left to retreat. They fought with a desperate, uncompromising ferocity that exhausted the American forces to the point of collapse. The primary human tragedy in this phase was the immense loss of Okinawan civilians. Historical accounts reveal a devastating interplay between the Japanese military and the local population. Japanese commanders, steeped in the doctrine of gyokusai, honorable death, and committed to ensuring no one survived to speak of surrender, actively spread propaganda that painted the Americans as inhuman beasts. Civilians were told that capture meant certain torture and murder. Under this powerful psychological manipulation, thousands of Okinawan men, women, and children committed mass suicide, frequently using grenades provided by the Japanese troops, leaping from the high cliffs into the swirling sea, or perishing in the caves where they sought shelter, caught in the crossfire or sealed by American explosives. The civilian death toll, estimated to be up to a third of the island's population, became a separate and agonizing measure of the battle's savagery, turning the liberation into an unprecedented societal catastrophe. For the American soldiers and Marines, the fighting was reduced to exhausting, gruesome work. They had to systematically clean out every pocket of resistance on the peninsula, facing soldiers who chose to die fighting rather than be captured. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and napalm, the sounds of machine guns echoing from limestone caves, and the desperate shouts of interpreters trying to persuade hidden civilians or soldiers disguised as civilians to surrender. On June 18th, the 10th Army suffered a catastrophic blow that briefly dimmed the prospect of victory. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the imposing commander of the entire ground operation, was observing the final push against a Japanese strongpoint when he was struck and killed by shrapnel from an enemy shell. His death, the highest-ranking American officer, killed in action during the entire war, sent a shockwave through the ranks and reinforced the pervasive sense of fatal danger that defined Okinawa. Despite the loss of their commander, the 10th Army, now led by Major General Roy S. Geiger, pushed the remnants of the Japanese defense to the final cliff face. On June 22nd, the battle officially ended with the final annihilation of the Japanese command structure. General Ushijima and General Cho performed ritual suicide seppuku in their final cave headquarters near Mabuni, cementing their status as ultimate examples of Imperial Japanese resolve. With their commanders dead, the remaining Japanese troops either fought to the last man or, in rare cases, were finally captured. The island was declared secured on July 2nd, 1945, but the victory was hollow, stained by blood and unimaginable loss. Okinawa was indisputably the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Over 77,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, and the shocking civilian losses stood as a testament to the battle's unique tragedy. For the American forces, the cost was equally devastating, totaling over 49,000 casualties, including nearly 12,000 killed or missing in action across the Army, Marine Corps, and Navy. The naval losses alone, largely due to the Kamikaze attacks, exceeded all previous combined Navy losses in the theater. This ghastly toll had an immediate, profound impact on the strategic calculations unfolding in Washington. The battle for Okinawa, initially conceived as a necessary prelude, had become the ultimate warning. The strategic implication of the human cost at Okinawa was immediate and terrifying. The reports filtering back to President Harry S. Truman and his strategic planners in Washington, D.C. painted a grim, uncompromising picture. The Japanese military, far from yielding, was achieving greater efficiency in killing Americans the closer the Allies got to the home islands. The casualty figures were not just numbers, they were a political argument, paid in blood, against the proposed invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall. Downfall was planned in two massive phases: Operation Olympic, targeting the southern Japanese island of Kyushu in November 1945, and Operation Coronet, targeting the main island of Honshu and the Tokyo Plain in the spring of 1946. Planners had estimated that the defense of Kyushu would involve roughly 500,000 Japanese soldiers, but Okinawa demonstrated that the defense would be far more intense, encompassing not just professional soldiers, but a mobilized civilian populace, ready to fight with bamboo spears, makeshift weapons, or simply their bare hands. Spurred on by the fanatical concept of national sacrifice, the key lesson derived from the carnage of Okinawa was proportionality. In securing a relatively small, strategically marginal island, the Allies had suffered nearly 50,000 casualties in just under 3 months, largely because of the strategic depth of the defense and the psychological weapon of the kamikaze. If the Americans paid 50,000 casualties for Okinawa, what would they pay for Kyushu, an island many times larger and imbued with the sacred identity of the homeland? The military planners' estimates for Operation Downfall became apocalyptic. The lowest forecasts predicted 250,000 American casualties. The highest the figures Truman was forced to consider ran into the millions, with a corresponding loss of millions of Japanese lives, both military and civilian. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, summarized the grim reality: the Japanese would meet the invasion with an intensity that would eclipse every preceding Pacific battle combined. The Japanese, having seen the utter destruction and the civilian death toll on Okinawa, were prepared to execute a national suicide. It was into this abyss of strategic calculation that the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project, suddenly became not merely a theoretical weapon, but a desperate military necessity. While the scientific endeavor had been running for years, the primary justification for its use was solidified by the harrowing results of the Okinawa campaign. The alternative to using the bomb, as defined by the casualty lists of the final Pacific battles, was an invasion so costly it threatened to undermine the entire American post-war strategy and demoralize the nation. The political decision was now simple. If morally agonizing risk the immense, calculable casualties of Operation Downfall, or deploy a weapon of unimaginable destructive power to force an immediate, unconditional surrender, the blood of Okinawa provided the ultimate tragic justification for the latter. The island, conquered at such a terrible price, was instantly converted into the forward air base necessary for the final phase of the war. Its captured airfields, paid for by the lives of Marines, soldiers, and sailors, would become the launch point for the missions that would follow. Within weeks of the battle's close, The political momentum in Washington shifted inexorably toward the deployment of the new weapon. The final terrible act of the Pacific War, the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later, was the direct, logical, and tragically inevitable consequence of the unyielding, sacrificial defense mounted by General Ushijima and the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa. Ushijima's strategy of attrition had succeeded in demonstrating the horrific cost of invasion. But in doing so, it had inadvertently confirmed the necessity of the nuclear option. The battle had failed to deter the Americans from war, but had succeeded in pushing them toward an outcome no one could have imagined just months prior. The victory at Okinawa was thus the war's defining paradox. It was the absolute triumph of American material power and relentless military determination. Yet it was also the ultimate proof of the Japanese will to national annihilation. The island's capture did not usher in peace. It merely provided the launching pad for the terrifying conclusion that redefined warfare forever. The legacy of Okinawa is therefore not just the story of a bloody island battle, but the narrative of how the cost of conventional warfare in 1945 became so unsustainable that it forced the world across the nuclear threshold, leaving the island as the sacrificial altar upon which the terrible calculus of the atomic age was confirmed. The ultimate horror of Okinawa was not merely the scale of the destruction, but the deliberate erasure of the line between soldier and civilian, between war and total annihilation. As the American forces secured the final pockets of resistance in the South in late June 1945, they did so amid a landscape of almost incomprehensible human tragedy. The pursuit of the remnants of the Japanese 32nd Army across the Cayenne Peninsula forced the Americans to push through thousands of Okinawan non-combatants trapped between the two opposing forces. The soldiers and Marines discovered that the caves and natural shelters, which Ushijima's troops had fortified and used as defensive positions, were also serving as the final refuge for entire Okinawan families. The resulting scenarios were the worst of the entire war. American engineers, ordered to seal the caves with demolition charges to end the fighting, often did so unaware of the desperate civilian population huddled within. The muffled explosions and subsequent screams became a permanent, haunting memory for the men who survived the battle. Even more disturbing were the numerous accounts of mass civilian suicide. The Japanese military, committed to the doctrine of absolute non-surrender, had waged a fierce psychological war against the Okinawan populace. They propagated terrifying myths that American soldiers were bestial, that women would be raped and all men tortured, and that honorable death was the only escape from capture. This fanatical indoctrination, combined with the presence of Japanese soldiers who sometimes provided the civilians with grenades and, in some cases, outright ordered their suicide, led to staggering levels of self-destruction. Entire families chose to die together rather than face the enemy. These mass suicides, often carried out at the sheer, desolate cliffs that marked the island's southern edge, underscored the unique barbarism of this battle, where political and military ideology turned upon the very people it was supposed to defend. The historical consensus places the Okinawan civilian death toll at well over 100,000, a casualty rate of nearly 1/3 of the population, a devastating indicator of a conflict where the traditional rules of warfare had completely dissolved into a strategy of societal destruction. The grim task of calculating victory fell to the surviving American command. General Buckner had been killed on June 18th, a high-profile casualty whose death immediately reinforced the perception of Okinawa's prohibitive cost. By the time the island was declared secured on July 2nd, 1945, the military statistics were staggering. The Americans had suffered over 49,000 casualties, including 12,000 dead or missing across the Army, Marine Corps, and Navy. The Japanese had suffered losses exceeding 110,000, including those who chose suicide over capture. The immediate aftermath was one of stunned exhaustion. The American forces had won the objective, but the price felt catastrophic. The island, now a vast pulverized cemetery of mud and coral, had served its terrible purpose for the Japanese command. General Ushijima's strategy had successfully converted Okinawa into the ultimate argument against Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The reports of 50,000 American casualties for a single peripheral island, coupled with the intelligence reports indicating that Japan was preparing to mobilize its entire population, including women and children, to resist the invasion, solidified the military necessity for a radical alternative. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and President Truman were left staring at a chilling set of options: proceed with the invasion and risk American casualties reaching 1 million or more, or find a way to shock the empire into immediate surrender. The blood spilled on Okinawa was thus the final, most persuasive evidence presented to the decision-makers that conventional warfare against an enemy of this resolve had reached an intolerable human cost. The battle was over, but its most profound consequence, the decision to cross the nuclear threshold, was just beginning to take shape. The strategic legacy of Okinawa extends far beyond the final body count. It is a narrative interwoven with the most profound decision of the Second World War. With the island now a scarred, occupied staging ground, the high-level debate raged in the halls of power, pitting the certain horror of invasion against the unknown terror of the atomic bomb. Okinawa had provided irrefutable proof of the Japanese state's commitment to total war, encompassing military, civilian, and national self-destruction. This proof was the catalyst. In the first week of July 1945, barely days after the final shots had been fired on the Cayenne Peninsula, President Truman sailed to the Potsdam Conference. While the Allies publicly prepared to issue the final ultimatum to Japan, Truman held the most closely guarded secret in human history: the Manhattan Project had succeeded. Yet, even with this unprecedented power in his hand, the use of the bomb was not a casual choice. It was presented as the lesser of two evils, the alternative to the unimaginable slaughter predicted for Operation Downfall. The numbers from Okinawa, meticulously compiled and studied by American military analysts, were the silent, ghastly evidence that swung the argument. If a battle for a single island, a remote corner of the Japanese Empire, could yield 50,000 American casualties and over 100,000 civilian deaths, the invasion of the mainland, protected by the deeply held ethos of Gyokusai honorable death, would eclipse these figures exponentially. Estimates place the potential American losses at anywhere from 250,000 to over 1 million, with General Marshall's staff suggesting the ultimate cost could result in the death of millions of Japanese citizens and soldiers. The alternative was a protracted blockade and firebombing campaign, which would likely have prolonged the war by months, inflicting similar massive casualties through starvation and conventional destruction. It was this bloody matrix, the cost of Okinawa, the expected cost of downfall, and the immense pressure to end the war swiftly, that made the atomic option appear, chillingly, as the most humane choice to the war-weary American leadership. Okinawa had convinced them that only an overwhelming, catastrophic shock could break the Japanese government's iron will and bypass the need for a ground invasion. When the uranium bomb, Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, followed by the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki 3 days later, the world changed forever. These two acts, separated by a continent and a few weeks of time from the battle's end, were the direct, strategic conclusion of the sacrifice paid on the coral ridges of Okinawa. The island, conceived as a critical military objective, had inadvertently become the sacrificial evidence that validated the nuclear age. The unyielding defense of General Ushijima, intended to deter invasion, had instead provoked the ultimate, irreversible escalation. In the final analysis, The Battle of Okinawa stands as the ultimate paradox of the Pacific War. It was the moment American military might achieved its most complete, decisive victory. Yet it was also the battle that, through its horrifying cost, convinced the victors that their conventional methods had become politically and morally unsustainable. The island itself, still bearing the deep scars of artillery and flame, remains a somber monument not only to the soldiers who died there, but to the tragic calculus that pushed humanity into the nuclear era. Its story is not just one of fierce fighting, but of a final, terrible accounting of human cost that shaped the global order for decades to follow.